Good morning, everybody. How are you guys? It's me, Luis. It's not Brent. Brent is stuck on a plane right now. He was flying back from the Burst and Impact event in Florida yesterday. His flight got delayed at his connection, and so he ended up getting stuck in Houston overnight. And so he's on a plane now heading home to Phoenix. And so I've got to jump in again, just like yesterday. And but I'm glad to see that all of you folks are here. Kara, Cheryl, nice to see you. Josh is in, and I saw Anthony was back in, of course. How are you guys this morning? So, as you can see, we've got Julian Stodd in the room. I was lucky enough to meet Julian back in 2014 in San Diego at a Guild event. And he also spoke at our 2016 TLDC event, did a fantastic job keynoting. I mean, probably my favorite session of the entire event. Anthony, you're confused? Julian is also an author, artist, founder, and captain of Sea Salt Learning. And today, I'm just going to let him take over because he is going to be incredible at this. So everybody, welcome Julian, and enjoy.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, unusually for me, I don't know where to start. I've taken this TLDChat at its word, and I'm assuming that you'd like to chat. So I'm here poised to answer your questions. I might start off by sharing a couple of things because Cheryl was asking about the Trust sketchbook, so I'm going to share that with you perhaps to start things off. But if you put any questions up or ask me what you'd like to talk about, then I'll be happy to do so. So the Trust sketchbook is an attempt to explore the nature of trust in organizations. And the reason that I'm interested in trust is because it flows through everything that we do. If we talk about social learning, where we want people to engage in collaborative spaces, if we talk about social leadership, if we talk about organizational change, pretty much anything we talk about, we end up using the word trust. And I see Anthony is trying to throw me off straight away with some philosophical questions, but we'll get on to philosophy later, don't you worry. So I've started doing the Landscape of Trust research. Landscape of Trust research is the largest research project in the world this year about trust. You can find it either through my blog or my Twitter feed if you're interested. And it explores the nature of trust, how trust exists between individuals, how trust exists within communities such as this community, how trust flows into organizations themselves. And also, quite interestingly, it explores how trust is impacted by technology. Now, the prototype study last year had about 5,000 people taking part. And it came up with some interesting early results. People trust formal technologies about 30% less than they trust social technologies. That was quite interesting to me. They clearly use different words, experience a different sense of ownership and consequence, but all this money that organizations are plowing into procuring and owning formal technologies may be in vain because people actually trust the technologies they own themselves. So I've been exploring trust in all sorts of ways, but what I've started doing recently is playing around with this. I shall show you this. Now you'll notice that I don't have a sophisticated way of doing this, except blocking out my head. This is the Trust sketchbook. And you're the first people ever to see it, except for some photos on Twitter. It's a Moleskine book, in fact. I rather like these. I use these for watercolor painting normally. But the reason I'm doing the sketchbook is because the Landscape of Trust work is a scientific study. It's a full critical discourse analysis of what trust means. It's building some diagnostic tools. And it's one way of looking at trust. But I quite like the idea of also looking at trust through art. In fact, and you will have to forgive the very amateur nature of this presentation, but I'm just going to show you this page. Now, I think I can show it sort of at a distance. There you are. It says, is trust an art or a science? and it's really to position those two things. We can explore trust, we can quantify it. There are all sorts of established metrics to measure trust. And but this is a co-created and co-drawn book. So you'll see it's just sketched. The only word I'm painting in it is trust. That's always painted in red. But the rest of it, people fill in themselves. So it's interesting, actually, because a few people are making, asking questions or making comments about trust. And there's some interesting stuff that shows through the initial analysis, I'm only 13% into the primary data gathering. And a few interesting effects have come up. The first, which I think is one of the most fascinating, is that there are clear gender-based differences in how people talk about trust. So what you find in the analysis of the first 130 accounts is that when men talk about trust, they nearly always use the word trust. And when women talk about trust, and this is in the vast majority of cases, they tend to use words like mistrust and distrust. So it's a statistically significant difference in how often those words are used. What does it mean? I literally have no idea at the moment. It's very early in the study. The group of people who are in the study are self-selecting, so it could simply represent a bias in the groups that I'm engaging with directly. But there are some other interesting effects. So I think Alice has said at AA, now I don't know if you're referring to Anthony, but since you've used the initials AA, I'll tell you one of the most interesting things I did last week was I ran an interview session with members of Alcoholics Anonymous talking about trust in Alcoholics Anonymous, which was really quite fascinating. Had a group of people who were kind enough to open up to, they have to deliberately breach their commitment to anonymity. They gain a permission from their community to do so. And I had 6 people there and talked about the nature of trust in a therapeutic group like that, where there's a high social consequence of being exposed. You know, if somebody is exposed as being an alcoholic, it could have a high reputational impact. So it was a really very interesting piece. In the second phase of this research, I'm going to carry out a lot of one-to-one interviews with people. It was a very intense session, I have to say. For the second time this year, I got brought to tears in the middle of a presentation by one of the ladies that was sharing her story about going into that group. She went into her Alcoholics Anonymous group with 30 people. There were 30 people when she started. And 8 years later, there were 2 of them still alive. And she said that's a fairly typical figure with the severity of alcoholism that people are battling. 28 of her fellow members of her community had died in the last 8 years. So, you know, when people are talking about trust in that context, it puts a pretty serious spin on things. So there we are. That's to kick us off with the lightweight note of trust. But anyway, this is the Trust Sketchbook. I say you're the first people to see it. I've just decided, I realise, Alice, you and Anthony are both there, so I was only semi-frivolously grabbing hold of your use of AA to move us into that space. It is interesting, actually. Some of the other groups, I'm signing up research partners for the Landscape of Trust work. So as well as trying to gather 1,000 open narratives, I'm also trying to sign up an initial 30 organizations to take part in it. So we've got all sorts of interesting groups. I've got a group of Quakers taking part, a group of Muslims, a group of Special Forces soldiers in the US. I've got 3 or 4 groups from the NHS, the National Health Service, in the UK. I've got a group from an insurance company, and it'll be really interesting to see if people in these different contexts describe trust in different ways. I'm actually hoping, it's not confirmed yet, to have a group of adult entertainment industry workers in the US also taking part in it, talking about the trust that exists within groups like that. So it's quite a fascinating subject. So you can tell me, what would you like to talk about next? Anybody that knows me will know I can quite happily talk forever. So I think somebody was asking Who was asking this? Somebody was asking about the book on music and learning. Okay, I'm gonna talk about the music piece, and then I'm gonna come back to Anthony's comment. Yes, so the book on music and learning is quite interesting. It'll actually be it's really one of my most deeply researched books. I started writing it in 2013, and it's in two clear parts. The first part is about the neurology of music, about how music works. How do we actually understand music? How do we learn it? How does it express different layers of meaning? And in the second half of the book, I've interviewed 40 musicians about their experiences of learning music, how their experience of learning music has impacted on other aspects of their learning. And then some really interesting stuff about creativity, about the creative process. And one of the really interesting results from it was that people broadly broke down into about 3 areas. So about a quarter of those musicians described how they can only be creative in isolation. They literally describe how the process of sharing their work, and so I will come on to working out loud, which someone's asking me about. They say how the process of sharing their work is purgatory. They hate having to share their creative effort. For them, the creative act is an individual one. About half of the group said they can only be truly creative as musicians when working with other musicians. So that co-creative piece is what they need. They share an idea, they need to riff off it with somebody else, and then through that process, they're able to be creative. About a quarter said that they could only be creative through performance. So only through sharing and rapidly iterating their work, so performing something new and getting feedback from the audience, did they feel that they could be truly creative. Now again, 40 is not a huge sample size, but it is quite interesting. So I started that work, I think in 2013. I had most of the book written by 2015, but I haven't published it yet because it's so interesting. I am really quite tempted to go back into it more deeply and to develop it out into a wider piece. The only piece I have taken forward from it is if you've read any of my work around social learning or around social leadership, although I don't explicitly make this point in either of those works, both of them talk about co-creation, and that work is directly influenced by the work looking at music and learning. And if you are, I was given a bit of a hint that some of you might be interested in music. So you may know the work of Oliver Sacks, who sadly passed away a year or two ago, but was one of my very favorite authors, a neurologist who wrote about a wide range of subjects. But he wrote a really wonderful book called Musicophilia, which is about the love of music, and that's very influential on my own work in that space. I'm glad that Louis has asked me about my background in music. I am a very happy amateur. I'm extraordinarily bad player of the banjo. I can occasionally ring that into tune and play it. I play acoustic guitar mainly, quite badly. So I won't be gracing this stage with any performance. So a quick aside, let me just read what Anthony was saying here. You were saying, well, in fact, there were a few things about trust, which we'll jump back onto. Do we trust the internet and the government? Well, that is a very interesting question. If you're interested in that, Alice, I've written on the blog a couple of pieces about President Trump, explicitly exploring actually types of power. And that really builds out of a range of work I do with the military, mainly academic research into resilience and types of power. And it explores how we're seeing the emergence of new types of power. And explicitly, I'm interested in the difference between hierarchical power, which is that held within a position within a system, and networked power, which is that held within a community. So networked power is the type of power that powers social leadership. It's probably also the type of power that has got President Trump elected. And what is interesting, well, I find it interesting anyway, but I'm easily interested by all sorts of things, is how he's taken this very deliberately different attempt to communication. So the article, if you're interested in that, to look for on the blog is called something like Trump Communication in the Social Age. And it looks explicitly at how he's trying to get a primary mechanism of engagement through social channels direct to consumers, and deliberately moving out that interpretative layer of the formal media. And it's really been quite fascinating to see how that plays out. I think I shared, Alice, the figure that people trust formal technology about 30% less. To give you a different context on that, in some of the social learning work, where I've been able to work with different cohorts on different types of technologies, I've had some very interesting results. So working with a Saudi Arabian oil company on leadership development, I was able to put 10 cohorts through an identical social learning program. Half of them on formal technologies, an SAP learning management system, Yammer chat function, and so on. And half of them on social technologies, so using private WordPress sites, private LinkedIn groups, and WhatsApp. And the group that went through on the social technologies had engagement about 6 times higher than the ones on formal technologies. And to me, that speaks clearly of people understanding intrinsically that on social technologies, what they say is hidden, it's under their own control, it's impermanent, it's a privately owned space. So they feel more able to engage, which is really, I found really quite fascinating. Now, Anthony, what was your point here? Sorry, quick aside. I used to work with HIV prevention, and one of the other organisations had a webpage bragging about their online outreach efforts to minorities, youth, Amish, and the underserved. Yeah, so I guess you might need to steer me in the direction. It's interesting. There's all sorts of research. I'm not very familiar with it, but I know there is interesting research around generally around both sexual health and sexual identity, looking at anonymity. So what we do see is that when people are able to anonymously engage in social collaborative spaces, they are much more likely to explore a range of different opinions. So if we think about the nature of intractable argument in social spaces where people feel pressured to remain firmly in their position, deeply entrenched conflict, one way of getting around that can be to allow greater anonymity in terms of engagement. But quite a controversial area. A news release: Trump's ordered an investigation after Britain accused the US officials of leaking details. Well, there we go, Alice. We could probably amuse ourselves all day with stories of our current political setup, but I'll plow on in a different direction, and I'll see how political you all want to get in the chat room. And unless I'm reading this right, you'll have to tell me. I think you can vote these questions up if you want to, so do feel free to ask. Actually, just to Anthony's point, I should point out the trust research isn't explicitly, it's not just looking at trust online, it's looking at 4 types of trust: trust between individuals, trust within communities and teams, trust within organizations, and then the 4th part is trust as impacted by technology. Yeah, I'm with you on that, Anthony. Hey, there's Marco. How are you? Yes, so funnily enough, well done, Marco, for spotting that I am, in fact, sitting on my bed, but I should point out that I'm not in my bed. But I am currently staying with my parents, and so I have, it's my father's birthday tomorrow, so I've come over here. So I've been relegated to my bedroom. I've been sent to my bedroom to do this. Although I should point out that quite typically when I work with Google and do these kind of sessions, it's not in the least uncommon to find people in bed. Or on one occasion, one of the participants in my group was on the beach having just come in from surfing. So he definitely trumped me there, if you'll forgive me mentioning the T word again. So I'll talk a little, thanks Josh, I'll pass that on. I'm surrounded by paper, weirdly. In a digital space, I'm sat on my bed surrounded by paper. I've showed you the Trust sketchbook. Let me show you another image from that, just in case you're interested. I don't know if you will be, but let me find something for you. What's going on in here? I showed you the art or science page. This one here is about how is trust built. and you can see you get to fill some of it in yourself. I probably should. I don't really do plugs very much, but tomorrow I'm quite excited because my next book actually arrives. It's called Social Leadership: My First 100 Days, and it's a workbook. It has 100 different activities over 100 different days that you can participate in. So that's quite exciting. So I'm just going through the process of getting that up on Amazon at the moment. It'll launch, I think, on the 17th of June. Well, antisocial leadership is very interesting, Anthony, because of course a lot of you're absolutely right. Most of the notion of social authority is about how social authority counters or stands up to or subverts formal authority. So you might say sort of antisocial leadership, but I would still call it social leadership. It's a community claimed voice rather than one that's been given. And with that, I will neatly segue into talking about the change book. Somebody was asking about resistors to change and the working out loud process that I'm doing this week. So you actually are the only group I'm talking to this week. In fact, you're the only thing I'm doing this week except writing. This is the manuscript for the book, which I'll publish probably in August or September this year. And it will probably be called The Change Handbook, with a subtitle, Building the Socially Dynamic Organization. This, it probably also, you'll note there's a lot of probablys here, which is what you say a lot when you're working out loud. This is 380 pages. It's currently, well, at the beginning of the week, it was 65,000 words. It's probably about 70,000 words at the moment. But I've been working on this body of work for about 3 years, and it's almost complete, I have to say. If I sort of pull my finger out, I'll have this completed to a full draft by the end of the week. This is actually the 12th draft. It will be at draft 13 at the end of the week. And then I have a full week in June where I'm going to start on page 1 and work my way through. And there's quite a bit of sanding off of the edges to do. But so the working out loud process is really one of just continuously iterating it. I tend to share extracts. I've just published one today actually on the blog as I'm going through it. So that's the change book. It's about a co-created and co-owned model of change. The resistors of change, that there's a question here which has 1 vote. So as we have no electoral college on this chat, I'm going to take 1 vote as counting, and I'm going to talk about that next. The resistors of change are one of the frameworks I use in the book. So it actually looks at 16 resistors of change and 16 amplifiers of change. Now, I'm quite interested on this. And in fact, I'm not using any slides or anything today, but I've just completed the first prototype of a diagnostic around this with a global engineering organization. It's got about 32,000 people. And the diagnostic has explored, just with an initial population of 1,000, their ability to change. It's based around those 16 resistors and 16 amplifiers. The resistors, for example, are grouped. So some of them are about technology. How does technology resist change? Through the ways that the investment in technology is controlled, through capability that is held within the formal organization on technology, and so on. There are cognitive aspects of change. So 4 of the resistors are cognitive aspects of habit, of uncertainty. How do we respond in uncertainty? 4 of them are about communication, authenticity in communication, or the formality of communication. So it's quite interesting work. They're not really positioned to be a definitive list. I've really positioned them as 16 out of a wider potential number. But the premise really of the change work is that most formal change programs fail, and they fail really because they are formal. They rely on people who are supposedly experts putting together a change journey and then pushing people through that journey. In the course of that journey, people are disenfranchised, they're depowered, they're alienated, and it's really experienced as the organization exerting control over the individual. So in this work, I look more at how does an organization frame change, but then co-create. So again, you'll hear me using that term. How do we co-create the pace of change and the space of change? So I think, and I'm the only person that's read it so far, so I'm allowed to have an opinion. I think it's coming together reasonably well. I've been prototyping various aspects of this work, so I generally like to explore how you can start with ideas and then prototype work and then gradually pull it together and publish it. So that's that piece there. Now let me just come on to one of these questions. I don't know who asked this question. I can see Kara's commented on it. Are corporates getting the whole social learning philosophy, or are they kicking and screaming? Well, very interestingly, they are getting it. In as much as 5 years ago, I think when I talked about social learning, people, organizations generally weren't doing it, but you'd find odd people who said that's very interesting, and that was it. 2 years ago, 3 years ago, they were saying we'd like to try something. Nearly every organization I go into now is very interested in social learning. They're not just very interested, they're typically doing something about it. And I'm lucky to work with a very broad range of organizations, many many of them complex, global, multicultural, secure, compliant, regulated, and all the rest of it. Most of them are trying. Many of them are leading with technology. They're putting in place social collaborative learning management systems. Very few of them are focusing on core skills. I'm particularly interested in storytelling as part of social learning, how we can use different levels of narrative. Some of them are doing well in individual projects, but they're failing to, the language I'd use, become fully socially dynamic. And when they ask me, again, it's quite common that executives say, what are other people doing that's failing? So they sort of demonstrating a willingness to learn from other people. The simplest story I can tell is when organizations get as far as trying social learning, they often think their challenge is engagement. When people do engage, they hit the true challenge, which is that they don't always like what people are saying. So, you're encouraging people to co-create stories to surface the tacit tribal wisdom of the organization, which sounds like a really good idea until you hear what the organization has to say, and they say something you don't like. So whilst I'd say, most of the organizations I operate with tend to think their challenge is how to drive engagement, whilst their true challenge is how to earn engagement, and crucially to know how to respond to it when they get engagement. If you look at the sort of more advanced organizations, the ones that are really nuanced in what they're looking at, they're probably looking at two key areas. One is the capability of their teams. So teams who are historically perhaps designing and delivering significant kind of e-learning and learning design programs. There are new skills that they need, skills around storytelling, skills around facilitation, in my language, skills around instructional design for scaffolded social learning. And they're also looking at the skills for the individuals themselves. It's referred to under different headings in different organizations. Sometimes you hear people talking about skills of the digital learner, which I don't really like that term, but it's certainly, how do we explore, how do we ensure that individuals know how to learn and thrive in this space? So I'm certainly seeing a great deal of movement in that. If you're interested in that, Cara, or anyone else, sorry, I'm trying to remember who else asked the question. I'm just finishing at the moment quite a substantial piece of work with an organization called the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, which is very interesting. It's an NGO, a non-governmental organization, but it works with lots of other NGOs and disaster relief agencies in order to develop capability, learning and development, learning capability in humanitarian disaster areas. And for that, I've put together a learning architecture So it really takes, in terms of my own work, it takes my previous work on learning methodology, on social learning, on mobile learning, and it pulls it together. The architecture covers 8 aspects of learning and tries to show how an organization needs to address all of them. So it is about the underlying learning methodology. How do you establish social learning communities? What's the approach you take to storytelling? How do you co-create rules? How do you invoke consequence? How are you using game dynamics and game mechanics in learning? It tries to take a very holistic view of it. So I've published a little bit of that work on the blog. I'm sort of finishing that work over the next month, and I will publish a full generic version of that. But if you're interested in learning architecture, and it is an evolving body of work, then do drop me a note, and I'll be happy to share that out. Now, I noticed there were a couple of questions, I think, which I just need to jump back to. Marco, I think I've probably addressed that social learning piece. Alice here is saying, as learning techniques evolve, have we measured their success? The reason why I ask is that I repeatedly hear that students are getting stupider and stupider. Attention spans are decreasing and students want to be entertained as opposed to taking responsibility and initiative for their learning. Well, Alice, I agree with you. We hear that a lot, and if I read the tone of your question right, I also, or certainly I fundamentally disagree with a great deal of that. I think that there are many vendors in the market who are telling us that we need to go for micro-learning and that we need tiny chunks of learning. And there are many people telling us that attention span has gone to hell and is down there. What you actually find, if you look at engagement, is that for sure people are consuming small chunks of learning. But if the learning is supremely good, or if they are supremely motivated, they're consuming vast and complex learning stories that spread over huge periods of time and involve them having to get deeply involved in so doing. So I think it's frankly highly naive of any organization to sort of purport that the nature of how people learn has so fundamentally evolved. What I think we have truly seen is that people now have options. So the organization can no longer get away with just churning out the load of old rubbish that they've churned out for so many years. You know, for years they've pushed out 12 or 16 hours of compliance training a year, and people have completed it. But it's a delusion to imagine that they completed it because they were fundamentally different people back then. They completed it because they had to. The reason why people are doing stuff differently now is because they can do. So Anthony's saying there's been this belief that videos can't be more than however many minutes, that lessons shouldn't be. Yeah, exactly, Anthony. It's very sketchy at best. I think the only conclusion I would draw from it is that we've got a great deal of evidence that people won't engage with material that's not worthy of their engagement. Now, I'm being slightly flippant there. I mean, there certainly is evidence in the neurology around attention. There's some quite solid research showing how attention, and I'm just working from memory here, but effectively attention doesn't hold for a full hour. There's a point at about 20 minutes in when people drop right down. Engagement can drive attention back up. So there are certainly lessons that we can take from neurology. But as Marco's saying there, you know, if the story is good and if the engagement is good, they will engage. My own sort of approach to this, as you probably know if you've come across any of my work around social learning, is to say we should be creating these scaffolded learning experiences. So less broadcast as a model of learning. He says with some irony, as I appear to be the only person talking on the session, but more engagement with co-creation. And again, if you're interested in that, if you look on the blog, you'll see I've written a piece about 10 co-creative behaviors. That's what I am focusing on at the moment in social learning design. So we can actually sort of engineer that in place. So Paul's joining us from the Science Museum of Minnesota. Nice, yeah, excellent. I've been to Minnesota, which I quite enjoyed. Is that where the Mall or the Mall of the Americas is? Somebody remind me if that's right. Paul, tell me, am I thinking of the right place? Mall of the Americas. I seem to recall going there. The biggest shopping centre in the world. I'll have to be careful what I say if it is, because it was pretty dreadful. It is, yeah. I have fond memories of sheltering from a rainstorm and then getting lost in there for about a week. So, what else have we got? We got about 25 minutes. It did have the internal roller coaster when I went there. It was pretty fun. So let me see, what other questions have we got here? Somebody was asking about the Social Age Safari. Well, I've just finished the Social Age Safari, which is a conference I run every year for 70, what I would say are explorers of the social age, people who are interested, I guess, in this space. The Social Age Safari is a scaffolded social learning experience. So it's 2.5 days long. There are no presenters. There's no trade element. There's simply a group of people coming together, and we take them on a voyage, literally on a boat, actually. It's not a real boat, it's a metaphorical boat. But the whole space is dressed up, and we go and we explore different areas. So this year we explored the landscape of trust. We explored the socially dynamic organization, and we explored emergent technology and its innovation and impacts. And it was quite fascinating. So in the trust section, I've already mentioned that we had the Alcoholics Anonymous panel come in. I also had a group of graffiti artists come in, talking about graffiti as a voice claimed by the community, and specifically actually talking to them about gang structures within graffiti. So if you think about organizations like to talk about tacit and tribal knowledge and social learning, and that's quite a good example. You know, if you as a sort of 13-year-old pick up a spray can and head out, you're by yourself. You have to learn how to do graffiti, but sooner or later you bump into other people, and you start to encounter what the rules are. It turns out there are quite clear rules laid out of who can paint over whose work, where you're allowed to paint. Some of those rules are formal and legal, but many of them are tribal rules held within communities. So the 3 graffiti artists that I had come in talked about the gang that they're part of. It has about 85 members based down in Bristol. They talked about the induction mechanisms into that gang. They talked about how you progress up the structure, how you earn reputation. So really, it's quite fascinating, because to me it speaks about if I had that conversation within IBM or Microsoft, I'd have an almost identical conversation about power structures, induction, learning, tribal rules, and so on. So, for me, part of the fun of that event is being able to expose ourselves to those kind of conversations. I had a very interesting group of people come in from creative collectives. So these are, they were talking in the section about leadership without leaders. So one group lives in a squat in London, and they take on community art projects, often ones that breach rules as well. So some of their art projects are themselves squatted or painted or installed without permission. But it was very interesting, both for them and indeed the Alcoholics Anonymous. They operate without formal leadership structures. AA is interesting, and for Anthony and Alice's benefit, I'm talking about the Alcoholic Anonymous version of AA. They're deliberately not allowed to hold funds. They're not allowed to have leadership by their charter of setup. They're not allowed to own property. So they're organizations which are very much owned and controlled from the bottom up, really in direct opposition to how many of the organizations around us work. So anyway, there's me whittering on. What would anybody else like to talk about? The learning techniques, I'll just touch on this point actually. Have we measured the success of learning techniques? I very often get asked this around social learning. In fact, when you present this at CLO type of level, it's really the first question that you get asked is how effective is it? And the answer to that is if you triangulate your measures of success, it can be highly effective. And by that I mean using storytelling approaches, you can tie into self-reported measures of learning and change. Using 360 type approaches, you can get managers to report on observed learning, and you get the community to report on each other's learning. I did triangulate. Yeah, what did I get it wrong? I may have said something wrong there, Dana. Yeah, triangulate between a number of these measures is generally what I say. But crucially, of course, social learning is about effectiveness. It's about getting stuff done. It's not about some abstract model of learning. Formal learning is often measured through utterly abstract measures of learning. You know, can you repeat the story back to me as I told it? Can you fit within this assessment framework which I've derived, which isn't grounded in any kind of application? Social learning, by contrast, typically takes place in your everyday reality. So social learning programs are typically longer than formal learning programs because people are sharing their real experiences in there. So so we do tend to find that that social learning is more applied and hence helps people to be more effective. You can probably identify easily 7 or 8 metrics that you could use. And I think if you triangulate between 3 of them, it gives you a very valid measure of the effectiveness and indeed return of investment for social learning, which is quite relevant. Now, I think, who was asking that? Sam, you were asking about distributed leadership model for Dash. I don't know if I know Dash, digital currency. Just give me a bit more context around that question. The main thing I'm interested in around digital currencies and blockchain technologies is actually that blockchain is a quantified measure of trust. So most trust that we have in organizations is unquantified. It's a belief-based mechanism of trust, whilst blockchain is actually a quantified mechanism of trust. It's actually one of the interesting things, again, in the trust research. I'm explicitly gathering 1,000 narratives of how trust fails. And bear in mind what I said earlier about gender-based differences in trust. One of the things which comes out as a very, very strong theme throughout the narrative accounts is the notion of implicit rules. And implicit rules are those which are held between us, but never explicitly stated. Apologies if that's very obvious, but I guess when you're talking about implicit things, you have to try to make them explicit. So people describe things like, I trusted so-and-so with a secret, and then they shared that secret. And that's how they describe trust failing. Now, the secret there was never an explicit rule to say, you know, there's no contract in place to say don't share the secret. But it's the breaching of that implicit rule. You know, if I share a secret with you now, I might not ask you explicitly to agree with it, but implicit in the act of me sharing is that I expect you to keep it. Most of the stories of trust involve that line being crossed. Some of the other things which are quite interesting, only 6% of people have ever had an explicit conversation about trust at work. Nearly always in the military. Military, it's over 80%. Manufacturing, it's under 1%. So it's quite fascinating. Alice, you're quoting Oliver Sacks at me, so I have to come to your point here. Neurologically, memorization and repetition exercise the brain compared to social learning science. Well, if I could sort of throw a few thoughts around that, and apologies if any of this is very obvious. Sometimes when we talk about sort of learning or learning science, we express a notion that sometimes the brain is working harder than as others. There seems to be quite a lot of evidence that the brain is kind of constantly working hard. So it doesn't, it's not really like the engine of a car. It's not idling and then suddenly we rev it up heavily when we need to do something. The brain itself seems to run at a fairly constant speed. Yes, Anthony, mine tends to go a bit faster after coffee, I'll admit. The things that do change significantly are attention. So attention is and I'll be careful of blundering my way into this. As a feature of consciousness, attention is the thing where, if we were stood in the pub, which wouldn't be the worst idea because here in the UK it's coming up to 5 o'clock. If we were sat in the pub having this conversation, we'd be surrounded by noise and other conversations, but we'd quite clearly be able to identify this conversation because our ears are attuned into it. Our attention is focused on this conversation. But cognitively, our brain is actually processing all the other conversations. So you can sit in a crowded room and without moving a single muscle in your body, you can tune into different conversations. You can switch your attention. So you can consciously move attention, but the key part of that is that consciousness focuses on where attention is lit up. So we are conscious of the conversation we're having, but cognitively, our brain is still hearing and processing all the other stuff. The way you tend to notice this is if you're having a conversation with somebody and you're focused on it, if somebody on the other side of the room says your name, you hear it. And you don't just hear it because they've said it louder. You hear it because your brain is constantly monitoring it. And it suddenly sort of knocks you on the inside of the skull and says, hey, somebody said your name. So where was I going with this, Alice? It's sort of exercising the brain. The notion of the brain being exercised is interesting. There's all sorts of evidence that using the brain, especially research around dementia, helps us maintain function. And a lot of that is probably to do with the plasticity of the brain. A lot of people are still, well, a lot of learning design is still rooted in reductionist into constructivist notions, whereby we look at somebody doing something, we can measure it, we can deconstruct it, we can figure out how they did it, and we can put it back together. This is often represented this sort of Victorian notion of phrenology, where you'd have a look at the skull and say, this is where language is processed, and this is where music is processed, and this is where your elbow moves. And it's largely nonsense. In fact, the whole left brain, right brain thing is largely nonsense. There's all sorts of evidence for this. Up to the age of about 12, you can have one entire hemisphere of the brain removed. So in certain cases of extreme epilepsy, they sever the corpus callosum, which is the bridge that connects the two halves of the brain. Now, if that's severed, it prevents there being any communication between the two halves of the brain. And it typically has almost no impact on creativity or action. Up to the age of 12, you can actually remove entirely half the brain. And it has very little impact on development. And since I was saying somebody, you know somebody, this is absolutely true. You can have almost full cognitive development with only half the brain in place. So the brain is highly fluid, it's highly plastic. There's some very interesting experiments using, there's obviously a great deal of interest in artificial eyesight. Can you see something if your eye is damaged using what we call like pin boards with a matrix of 12 by 12 pins. And you can fix that up to a camera, looking in black and white, code the color, how light or dark is one of those 144 pixels, if you like. And then depending whether it's light or dark, you push the pin in further or out further. Now, if you strap that device to the small of your back, so, right down in the small of your back, if somebody did that to you or me right now, linked in to a camera, we would make no sense of it at all. We would have no idea what that input was. But weirdly, people who've lost their sight can actually learn to see through that. They learn to process that signal. It starts to be processed through the parts of the brain that process optical signals. And it learns to read a different type of input. So your brain as a sort of processing unit is remarkably able to adapt. But we're getting deep into neurology here, which is, of course, great fun. For my sins, one of my first bits of postgrad work was around neurophysiology of learning. So how does the brain actually sort of work when we learn? But that was in the dim and distant past. And Anthony's point about the brain being trained, what is very interesting, the work I do with the military around resilience looks at framing. So how does context trap us into patterns of behavior? And that's a very interesting thing for learning. Organizations that build great strength through formal learning often are very brittle to different types of disruption. If you look on the blog and search under the term black swans, you'll find a body of work that I've done there around that space. A black swan event is used to describe things that are unknown or unknowable. It comes from a medieval notion of we used to know that swans were white and nobody had ever seen a black swan. So they said, well, that's, it's as unlikely as seeing a black swan. Today we'd say a flying pig. If I said it's as likely as a flying pig, you would understand that I meant it's never, ever, ever going to happen because it's unthinkable that a pig could fly. Well, of course, people then traveled to the Near East and discovered that there were black swans, and presumably they were shocked. There's a swan and it's black. But the point is, most risk modeling and work around resilience relies on the notion that we actually understand what's going on within the system. But in fact, we typically don't. That if you look at the failure of systems, it often happens through factors that are outside the range of things that are being modeled. It's very interesting. We might well see flying pigs, Sam. I get that. We've seen one over Battersea Power Station, but I think that was Pink Floyd cheating. Somebody was asking if I colour my artwork, which is kind. Yes, I do. I do all my artwork normally. Well, actually, my personal artwork, I paint. I normally paint watercolours, or in the last few years, oil paints, but I don't share many of those in my sort of professional space, if I have such a thing. But the artwork I share in the books and on the blogs is all done on the iPad, and I use an app called Paper, which many of you will know. It's a fantastic thing, just lets you draw on that. So I do most of the artwork there. The Trust sketchbook, which I've been waving around, I've just decided, I started it on the iPad, and I've decided that I'm going to draw the whole thing by hand, reproduce it photographically in the book. If you are interested, I'm not making a plea for this, but if you are interested, yes, I'm kickstarting it at the moment. So it's on Kickstarter. If you go to Kickstarter and search for me, you'll find it quite easily. But once it's gone ahead, it'll be available and round and about. So what else have we got? I think we've got sort of 5 or 6 minutes. Were there any other questions? Have I missed anything that got voted up? What's at the top here? I think it's gone quiet on the question front. Thanks for showing that, Anthony. That's kind. Yeah, Sam, you do some great work. I love it. So it's really good, especially all your podcasts. Podcasts, of course, hugely popular. I'm recording 100 podcasts next week for the social leadership. My first 100 days, I've decided I'm going to do 100 podcasts. You might be interested. I've just finished my first MOOC, not doing it myself, running it. It's called Foundations of the Social Age. It's 12 chapters, or they call them something else, but it's basically 12 sections looking at 12 aspects of the social age. I had about 400 people went through it. It was very interesting for me, just really the process of putting it together. And the level of engagement, I was actually quite staggered by the level of engagement. So it's still up, but it's unsupported at the moment. But if any of you are playing around with MOOCs, do stay connected. I really enjoy them, and I particularly enjoy winding up the universities by talking about how the MOOCs will demolish their business model because they're failing to adapt fast enough to all the change in the world. That's a whole other story. So I don't think I've upset too many Pink Floyd fans. Yeah, 100 podcasts, Sam, but they're going to be very short, 2 minutes each. Yeah, John and Yoko. Yeah, here I am. I don't know where Yoko's gone. I think she's off at work. Yeah, you found the MOOC there. So what else? Any last minute questions or thoughts? Do feel free to throw them in. What are your thoughts about micro moments and taking advantage to those spaces and time from a learning perspective? Micro moments, just give me the context for that, Josh. Micro moments. I think you're talking about who will be the next doctor. Well, I'm glad you asked that. I think they will go for a female doctor. Yeah, I think so. There's obviously, for the last couple of rounds, there's been great interest in whether it will be a black doctor or a female doctor. And my sense is that we're about ready for that. Well, I'm thoroughly enjoying the new series, so no spoilers. I've only seen the first 2. I met Peter Capaldi last year, actually. He was extremely nice. He took all sorts of time to play with my niece and nephew, who were absolutely, obviously taken aback by it. And I could tell it was the end of a long day for him. So, yeah, a lot of respect to him for that. It could be, yeah. Well, that's a whole other conversation, Anthony. I've quite enjoyed it. In fact, I've enjoyed them all. What's not to like about Doctor Who? I don't quite know how we got to Doctor Who, but there we are. I went in the TARDIS once, but that's a whole other story. You know, a friend who works at the BBC and got me in there to have a play with the TARDIS. And thanks to, it was Tom Baker era TARDIS, and thanks to my misspent youth, I knew what all the controls did, so I was able to run around it like an idiot, operating the doors and doing all that. And then later I went back to the BBC, and very sadly the TARDIS, you know, the walls with the old roundels that were recessed, they were all sort of stacked up in a dusty corridor. And you know, it was a little sad moment of seeing the TARDIS deconstructed. It's probably probably a lesson in life there. But there we go. So I think that we're coming to an end. If you're interested in any of these books, if you haven't got a copy, just ping me a note or get in touch through the TLDC group. I'll happily send you a copy.
Hey guys, I'm popping in here. I guess we'll close this up. Thank you so much, Julian. That was fantastic. That was a lot of fun. Great hour, and I'm sorry I didn't give you a break. Like 30 minutes in, I was going to stop you, but you were right in the middle of a point. And but I'm glad I didn't, because it was just great conversation. Everybody, I have an extra copy of the Social Learning Handbook that when Julian spoke at our event, he actually gave free copies to everybody. And so I had 2 of them. So I'm keeping one, but I've got this one available. If you guys are interested in it, what can we do? Sign up for our newsletter on TLDC.us, and I'll just pick randomly from there. If anybody who wants this copy, I'll just select whoever signs up and send you an email message and get your address, and we'll send it out to you. All right, so I guess that's it. Julian, thanks again so much. Sorry we couldn't have Brent for you. I'm sure he's going to hit you up and apologize later. But we really, really enjoyed your conversation and your support with our community.
Hey, that's great. Thanks, everybody. It was fun rambling away for an hour. And
you were great at it. You were great at it.
Oh, I talk a lot.
All right. Take care, you guys. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, guys. Thanks again. Don't forget TLDC 18 in January. I don't push everything out as much as Brent does, but that's because I don't know how. But hope you guys have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow, Video Friday. Come on, it's gonna be great. We have a guest. I think was it Hans de Graaf tomorrow. Sam is was kind enough to help us book him in, so that's gonna be a great session tomorrow, Video Friday. Don't miss it. It's a great way to end your work week. All right, take care, everybody.